I'm so excited to be here again this week. Thank you all for joining me for Cozy Crime Time. If you like hearing about true crime and you like listening to me, please hit the like and subscribe button so that I can continue doing what I'm doing. I truly appreciate all of you and everyone who has joined me for this journey. That being said, let's dive right on in to the crime that I have talked about today. As October came to a close, I truly enjoyed having a theme for our cases that we talked about. So I have decided to continue the themes through November and doing a no solve November. Decided to talk about only cases who are unsolved. I don't usually talk about cases that are unsolved because there is a part of me that fears that these people are still out there. You don't know where they are, you don't know what they're doing, and I have a family. I worry about the fact that I do have a family and a life, and we'll talk about people who have committed heinous crimes and were never caught. I will talk mostly about older cases due to that fact, and in today's case, we are going to travel back in time. We will travel back in time to a time of economic boom. It is best known as the Roaring Twenties, the Jazz Age, and even the Golden Twenties. This is a time of bootlegging, flappers, Babe Ruth, and growth after the end of World War I. Our case starts September 16th of 1922, when a young couple consisting of 23-year-old Raymond Schneider and 15-year-old Pearl Baumer had decided to continue their date with a walk along Easton Avenue in New Brunswick, New Jersey. The couple, in an attempt to find privacy, turned onto a well-known Lover's Lane area of De Rousse's Lane. This area was very secluded as there was an abandoned farm nearby, so couples went there all the time to use it as a Lover's Lane area. The couple walked through tall grass, just talking and working on their relationship. As they neared a crabapple tree on the property, Pearl noticed something was off. The couple got closer and saw two people under the crabapple tree near the road. They noticed that it was a man and a woman, fully dressed, but obviously not breathing. Raymond insisted that they leave the area and ran quickly to the nearest home of Edward Stryker, and they called the police. It is the 1920s, so things were a little bit slower, but the police were quickly sent to the scene. When policeman Edward Garrigan and Officer James Curran arrived at the scene, they were not fully prepared for what they were about to find. On the ground under the crabapple tree, they would find a woman and a man laying on their backs, dead from gunshot wounds. The man had been shot over the right ear with an exit wound to the back of the neck. This gave the inclination that he had been shot from above. The woman had been shot 3 times. She was shot under the right eye, over her right temple, and over her right ear. There was an exit wound to the back of the skull from one of these bullets. The bodies had clearly been positioned after death. They both had their feet facing the crabapple tree, and the woman's head was rested on the man's right arm, with torn love letters and cards scattered all around them. She was dressed in a blue dress with red polka dots, black stockings, and brown Oxfords, with her blue velvet hat off to her right. Her left hand had been placed on the man's right knee, and her brown silk scarf, that was now covered in blood, had been wrapped around her neck. The man was impeccably dressed with a Panama hat over his face. His face did don a pair of glasses. As they looked closer at the couple's attire and body positioning, they did find propped up on his shoe was a business card. The card was said to have either blood or fly droppings on it. They weren't really sure, as the blood would have been dried at this point. This card helped the police to quickly find the identifications of the couple. The investigation continued, and the police noticed a large infestation of maggots and flies on the woman's neck from ear to ear, pointing to the fact that the woman's neck had most likely been slit. They didn't touch anything as they didn't want to contaminate the scene. The presence of the bugs also showed that the bodies had been there for at least 24 hours. They did also find the man's wallet was in his jacket pocket, but his gold watch was missing. The wallet and business card identified the man as 41-year-old Reverend Edward Wheeler Hall. Edward Hall was originally a Brooklyn, New York native who had moved to Basking Ridge, New Jersey after receiving his degree in theological studies. He then moved to St. Evangelist Episcopal Church in New Brunswick, where he was the priest of the parish. He was married to Frances Stevens, a wealthy woman who was 7 years his senior, and they had been married since July 20th of 1911. The woman would also quickly be identified as 35-year-old Eleanor Mills. She was a member of the choir for Edward's church, and she was married to James E. Mills. The couple had 2 children, Charlotte, who was either 15 or 16, and Daniel Mills, who was 12. She was described as a small, slender, and pretty woman. Eleanor had a passionate soul that was not satisfied by the frugal way she was forced to live her life with her unassuming husband, who was a decade older than her. The case quickly became known and everybody wanted to be involved. There was a jurisdictional dispute in the beginning of the case, as the location of the bodies was near the border of Somerset and Middlesex counties, and this confusion and lack of fully paying attention to the scene led to onlookers accessing the scene of the crime. This quickly grew out of hand. The police could not contain all of the onlookers that were there. Policeman Garrigan may have also started some of the contamination of the scene when he allowed Albert Cardinal, a local reporter, to pick up the business card he found at Edward's foot and look at it. After this, the scene was in shambles. Most, if not all, of the physical evidence was destroyed. Onlookers began to walk all over the scene. The police could not control them. They began to dig up dirt, strip the pieces of the crabapple tree. The business card was passed around to the onlookers of over 100 people. The onlookers who dug up dirt were actually turning around and selling the dirt to other onlookers. The crabapple tree was picked almost clean of its bark and branches, and it was all but destroyed. These pieces were sold as well. Thankfully, before the love letters could become collateral in the curiosity of the case, the police gained control of the scene once again. Due to the confusion of jurisdiction as well, it took over 3 hours for the coroner to come and take the bodies to the morgue. Once they were examined, they did discover the time of death was closer to 36 hours before they were discovered, and it shows that they were killed on September 14th, 1922. The fact that they were on a lover's lane on a weekend but were not discovered for upwards of 36 hours did come off as odd. How did no one see them? It's Friday, it's lover's lane, people are going there. So either people saw them and didn't report them, or people didn't see them, which is odd in itself. The coroner did confirm the cause of death without doing a full autopsy, and they did discover a .32 caliber bullet that fell out of Edward's jacket as it was removed. They also confirmed that Eleanor had had her throat slit from ear to ear. The New Brunswick coroner would come and pick up Edward's body, but leave Eleanor's behind. Some of the contents of the letters were published in the tabloids in Trenton and in New York, and they were pencil-written letters that stated things like, "Sweetheart, my true heart, I have the greatest part of all true blessings, a noble man's deep, true, eternal love." And, "Oh, honey, I am fiery today, burning, flaming love." These were written from Eleanor to Edward, and Edward would return the sentiment by writing, "Dearest, I have so longed to talk with you, hold you in my arms. I want to hold you close, commune with you, hold you tight with my arm, and stroke your dear firm face with my right, and look deep into those wonderful eyes. hazel eyes. The discovery in the love letter was apparently no surprise, as the affair between the two was well known for at least 4 years. The policeman announced that the case would be solved quickly and not to worry. Due to the people involved and the scandalous nature of it all, the case quickly became front page news, not just in New Brunswick, but all over the country. The idea of a quick answer was not the case, though. Months went by and the case went cold. The police quickly gained their suspects. Edward's wife and her brother Willie were some of the main suspects in the case. Frances was the only daughter of Francis Kirby Stevens and Mary Carpenter. The Stevens family was one of the wealthiest and most predominant families in New Brunswick at the time, and she was even said to be related to the Johnson & Johnson family. Her and Edward lived in her family home, which they moved into after her mother passed away. And 7 years into their marriage, her and her brother inherited around $2 million. She said she knew nothing about the affair, and it was said that no one noticed any bad blood between her and Edward or anyone else. She was even said to have driven Eleanor home from having surgery 8 months prior to the murder. These accounts would be disputed because Eleanor's daughter, Charlotte, who was said to have loved Mrs. Hall, who helped in the Sunday school, but in the weeks leading up to the murders, Frances stopped speaking to Charlotte altogether. And after the murders, she refused to even see Charlotte. Charlotte would go on to say that Mrs. Hall acted very cold to me. Reverend Hamfrosky, who pastored a Hungarian church in town, said that Edward had confided that he intended to leave town with Eleanor and that a relative of his wife had threatened to kill him. The comment suggested one of Frances's brothers was involved. Frances's housemaid also apparently told her new husband that the rector, or Edward, was leaving his wife for Eleanor. According to the story presented to the police by the husband of the maid, on the night of the murders, she had agreed to go with Mrs. Hall and her brothers to the location of the murder. She was paid $5,000 for her silence. She later denied this encounter, but the seeds were already sown. As for Willie Stevens, he was born in 1972, and he owned a .32 caliber pistol like the one that was used in the murder. Although the firing mechanism was supposed to have been filed down so that he could not hurt himself or others with it, it was said that Willie had a mental disability that kept him from holding a job, and he was known to have a sunny disposition, but easily explosive and implosive, and he was somewhat reckless. He was said to spend a lot of his free time at the fire station playing cards, running errands, and he had always wanted to be a firefighter. But due to his condition, he could never achieve that dream. In the prosecution scenario, he provided the weapon, and his fingerprints were found on the business card left at the scene of the crime. Willie was a colorful character, and on the witness stand, he delivered credible and unsympathetic testimony. He had an eccentric personality, and he was consistent with what people nowadays might know as high-functioning autism. The condition at that point was not clinically described, and there was no conclusive diagnosis ever made of Willie, but it could be. Some may ask, well, what about Eleanor's husband? He was quickly dismissed as he was described as a pushover. Being a pushover does not make you innocent of crimes. It just means you're a pushover and people easily get things by you. He would even go on to say, my wife was not having an affair with the rector. I believe it was a woman's deed. It was jealousy, and I think her throat was cut in spite of her beautiful voice. This opened another door of opportunity. Maybe there was a parish feud between some of the women in the choir. Mr. Mills went on about his business. He was going to work. He even went to church looking for his missing wife after she left the home on the 14th. He did not, however, report her missing at any point. On the 15th, he went to work again, and he went to church, where he ran into Mrs. Hall. She stated that Edward had also not come home. He inquired on if she thought that they had run away together, and she said, "God knows. I think they're dead and cannot come home." It's an odd conversation for two people to have who supposedly had no idea that their spouses were cheating with each other. There were reports of people seeing the two during their missing hours, but it's really unknown and uncorroborated. With no breaks in the case, they decided to exhume the bodies and perform proper autopsies on them, as they had not been done before. The causes of death were consistent with the findings from the beginning. The only difference was that they now found that Eleanor's tongue had been cut out. With a stall in the case, the police thought that they had caught a break when a witness came forward. Jane Gibson, who lived with her son on the property where the bodies were found, came forward. Jane was known in town as the Pig Lady. She raised hogs for a living, and the hogs were on the property where this crime happened. She came forward and she stated that the night of the murders, she had heard her dogs barking around 9 p.m. She went out to see what was going on. And that's when she says that she saw the figure of a man in the cornfield. She stated that she got on her mule, Jenny. She rode after him toward Easton Avenue, and she went on to say that she then saw 4 figures at the crabapple tree. She heard a shot and saw one of them fall. She decided to leave as she heard a woman yelling, "Don't, don't, don't." As she turned away, she heard a barrage of shots and saw another person fall to the ground. She stated she then heard a woman yell, "Henry!" All eyes were on Jane, and some did question as to why she had not come forward sooner. She said she tried to, but the police wouldn't listen to her. I mean, she was known as the Pig Lady, so maybe they just thought that she was full of it. Her story sounded great, but there were some holes. First, it contradicted the findings that someone had shot Edward while they were standing over him. Secondly, it was very vague. She was told it was vague, and then she provided further details to her story. She stated that she had noticed an open touring car parked on Easton Avenue, like the one that you had seen driven by a chauffeur. It was when she turned around to cut across the field down a small lane that she saw 2 men and 2 women standing near a crabapple tree, arguing bitterly. A car coming into the lane behind her illuminated the people. She saw a woman in a long gray coat and a man with a dark mustache and bushy hair walking together toward the abandoned farm. A little later, she said she heard a woman ask, "How do you explain these notes?" She then added another item. She had seen Mrs. Mills run away after Edward was murdered. They caught her, dragged her back, and shot her 3 times. But that wasn't all. Jane soon recalled something else. She had lost a moccasin and at 1 a.m. rode back to look for it. As she came near the crabapple tree, she heard a woman crying. She went near and saw Mrs. Hall kneeling next to her husband's body, sobbing. She would later go on to describe her as a big lady with white hair. Mrs. Fraley, who lived directly across DeRossi's lane from the Phillips farm, contradicted this whole entire story. She said that she had heard none of the sounds that were described by Jane or any other sounds on her borders. In fact, she said she had seen Jane right after the murders, and the hog farmer said nothing to her. More doubt would soon be thrown towards Jane as her own daughter would come forward and say that she was a habitual liar. The change in her stories soon started to contradict themselves, and she seemed to just kind of love the limelight. She was said to tell reporters one story, police another, and then another to the witness stand later when she took the stand in court. In November, she eventually identified Henry Carpenter, who was the cousin of the Halls and lived just 2 doors down, as the man at the murder. There was a problem, however. Henry had an alibi. He was at dinner with his wife and their friends until around 10:30 p.m. on November 14th. The grand jury was convened to charge Frances Hall, but it would go nowhere, and the case would be dropped just 5 days later. Frances then, with everything going on, decided to move to Europe and try to live her life. Everyone else went back to their lives, and 4 years would pass, and Frances was living her life in Europe. The public had lost interest. They had all moved on. However, the case would be reopened by William Hearst when he began to look into the husband of the housekeeper who had talked to the police earlier. He focused on the testimony of the husband so intently that people became invested again, and the police quickly became invested again as well. The governor of New Jersey at the time, Harry Moore, would open the case again in full. The media focus was so strong that some say this is where the moniker, the crime of the century, may have come out. They used that in the tabloids when they were talking about it. August of 1926 would be another turning point. Frances and her brother Willie were again arrested and put on trial. Upon her arrest, she hired a well-known lawyer for her case, and in return, the state replaced their less experienced counsel with Alexander Simpson. Once appointed, Alexander would go straight to work. He went through all of the evidence, and he was quickly upset that a lot of the evidence was gone. It gave him a moment of pause because Willie's gun had been returned to him. Jim Mills, Eleanor's husband, came forward and, to no one's surprise, said that he actually did know about the affair between Eleanor and Edward the whole time. He said that he had threatened divorce proceedings, but he did not move forward due to the lack of funds in their family. Simpson quickly issued arrest warrants for Willie and Henry Carpenter, and a trial was called to establish bail for the men. This trial had 50 witnesses and lasted 4 days. The men were ultimately denied bail, and they were set to go before the grand jury. Alexander Simpson also decided that it was in fact Henry and Willie Stevens who murdered Eleanor and Edward, and Frances was just caught in the happenstance. Some other people believed that she had hired a hitman to kill them, making it a murder for hire and therefore making her more involved than anyone originally thought. They were doing everything to break down the alibis of the men. Ralph Gorsland was brought forward, and he was said to have also have had an affair with Eleanor at one point. He said that he was at DeRussey's Lane on the night of the murder, and he said that he was backing out at around 10 p.m. when he heard a shot, a scream, and then 3 more shots, a scream, a moan, and then nothing. Another man testified that he had seen scratches on Frances's face the day of Edward's funeral. And another woman said that she saw Henry Stevens in New Brunswick on the 15th, though he did tell police that he was 50 miles away in Lavallette, New Jersey. Henry was a retired exhibition marksman, and therefore that would have made it very easy for him to take the shot. There was also a witness that said that women in the choir threatened Eleanor because of her relationship with the pastor. Frances, her two brothers, and Henry Carpenter were all indicted on murder charges, and they all pled not guilty. Frances was the only one who had bail set for her. Her bail was substantial, but she was able to get it paid, and once she did, she was free to not stay in prison. State Trooper Dickman was brought in for the case, and he stated that he was paid to stop investigating the case. November 3rd was the first trial, which consisted of Frances and her two brothers. The jury, all members of which were male and married, were selected in just over an hour. The three defendants were on trial for the murder of Eleanor Mills and the murder of Edward Hall. The evidence included Willie's fingerprint on the business card that was found at Edward's foot. It included Mrs. Hall's anonymous call to the police to inquire about casualties, her brown coat that had been dyed black after the murder, and the fact that one of her private detectives was said to have tried to bribe a key witness in the case. Witnesses were called, first being a man named John Dickinson, who said that him and his wife had helped a disoriented Willie onto the trolley to the Parker House, which was an institute for the elderly near Phillips Farm, on September 14th. Next was Charlotte Mills, and she spoke again about letters her mother had written to Edward and letters that Edward had written to Eleanor, and how on the 14th her mother had left after making a call to Edward. Next up was Anna Hogg, or Hogg. She lived near the crime scene, and she had reported hearing shots. She also said that in 1923, Henry Stevens had come to her home at Phillips Farm to talk to her about the night of the murders. She stated that he was agitated and unsteady, almost passing out near where the murders took place as he was leaving. Ralph would repeat the stories he had already given to the police, and then a fingerprint expert was brought in. Fingerprint expert in the 1920s, I'm not really sure how much of an expert he would have been. But they stated that the fingerprints on the business card were in fact Willie's fingerprints, and they disputed the witness that put Henry in New Brunswick as well. Many witnesses came forward, one stating that the coat was taken to be dyed the next day due to a spot on it. Another witness stated that Willie had brought in a suit to the dry cleaner to also be cleaned due to a spot being on it. This was turned over to the police, but apparently was never found. Was, I guess, among the rest of the missing evidence. A man named Robert came forward stating that Jane was seen at Easton Ave the night, as well as a town car. And more witnesses came forward about being bribed or having seen things that night. Some were discredited, but not all. Jane, the pig lady, was wheeled into the courtroom on a stretcher as she was deathly ill and could not leave her bed. Her mother was there calling her a liar, all while she told her story, claiming that Mrs. Hall, Willie Stevens, and Henry Stevens were there on DeRussie's Lane that night. She seemed to have forgotten that in an earlier statement, she had seen only 2 people there with the victims. She had seen Henry Stevens and another man wrestling with the gun, and it went off. And then she told how Mrs. Hall's detective had warned her to keep her mouth shut. After Jane's testimony, the defense was ready to go. Henry Stevens' alibi stood and therefore made it that he was seemingly innocent of any crimes. Jane had testified that she had heard a woman say Henry, and since Henry Stevens was a marksman, he was looped into the case. Apparently, Henry Carpenter's family called him Harry instead of Henry. Therefore, Frances would not have called him Henry. She would have called him Harry, therefore making it that he was probably innocent as well. 2 other witnesses stated that he was not the man who stopped at Anna Hogg's house to ask about the murders. And Willie really stood his own on the stand. He was unbreakable. He used simple logic and he stood steadfast in his innocence. They asked Jane to identify the people that were at the scene of the murder that night, and she was unable to do so in the courtroom. Also, a man came forward stating that she had offered him money to corroborate her claims. They then spoke to Frances about her statement of them being dead. To what she stated, it just seemed like the logical conclusion. He also asked her about her night visit to Eleanor, and it came to nothing either. After 157 people were brought to the stand, 87 for the prosecution, 70 for the defense rested. The strange fact was that the young couple who had actually found the bodies were never brought to the stand. The jury took 3 separate votes over a 5.5-hour period, and eventually they came to an unanimous decision to acquit all 3 defendants. All charges were soon dropped for all of the men involved. Frances, Henry Carpenter, and Willie would go on to sue the New York Daily Mirror for tabloid libel, and no murder weapon was ever found. No one else was ever charged, and the evidence went nowhere. The case went cold, and it remains unsolved to this day. The fact that this case took place in 1922 may have helped with it never being solved. The fact that onlookers trampled the scene for a long period of time also may not have helped. There are so many theories as to what happened that night. Was it a robbery gone bad? Was a hitman hired? We may never know. But what we do know is that these 2 people lost their lives seemingly because they were having an affair. If you have any thoughts or questions, please comment below. I would love to hear what you guys all think. Again, thank you for being here. I truly appreciate you. And like I said in the beginning, if you like what you heard or you like being here with me, please hit the like and subscribe button. And I will see you guys again next week. Bye.